Welcome to tonight's Focus on Liberia. Tonight, as I said, we have with us some Liberian authors, poets, and journalists with us to share their experience and to share their voice in the Liberian community. Just to tell you a little bit about our guests, tonight we have Mr. Cherbo,
You want me to Cherbo Geeplay?
yes, Cherbo Geeplay, sorry. Born
Yes.
in Plibo, southeastern Liberia in West Africa. He is a Pan-African poet, and this Liberian native writes about Africa, the Liberian Civil War and its tragedy, and his Gribble heritage. His recently published short story, A Checkpoint Away from Dying, was published by a literary magazine in the United States, which foretold the dire struggles of a family desperately trying to survive a gruesome war. Geeplay was among the younger Liberian youth forced to attend college during the brutal Civil War. He studied at the University of Liberia, majoring in journalism at the Liberian College of Arts, and while in college, worked in the media as a senior staff reporter for several news outlets. His work has been described as layered and intelligent. His poetry first appeared in Seabreeze Journal in Liberia and in Blue Lake Review in New York, and also Rigorous, a New Orleans-based literary magazine, was also the publisher of his poems and debut short story. Geeplay has appeared in numerous publications and anthologies and was the finalist of the Adelaide Literary Award for Poetry in the Adelaide Literary Magazine in 2018. Also, Cherbo Geeplay is the editor of an online journal, The Liberian Listener, and lives in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada with his family. So, Cherbo Geeplay, tonight we say welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Manseen Logan. Let's spotlight her for a moment. Manseen Logan is currently a culture editor at Blavity Inc., a media company founded for and by Black millennials. Manseen is the founder of Go Team Liberia, a blog turned media company that supports Liberian athletes. She once served as a communications consultant for the Liberian consulate in Georgia, helping to create and edit content for the web and print. Manseen holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Management from Clark University and a Master's in Writing from the Savannah College of Art and Design. Manseen recently published a children's book entitled Better Together, which takes readers into the tropical rainforests of Liberia to learn from its special animals. So, Manseen, thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us. Next up, we have Mr. Nvasekie Konneh.
Thank you.
He is a Liberian writer, poet, magazine publisher, community and cultural activist whose work has been widely published in newspapers and on websites in Liberia, US, and Europe. Years before coming to the United States in 1995, Mr. Konneh's commentaries and poems on politics, arts, and culture appeared regularly in the I newspaper, the Monrovia Daily News, Inquirer, and the New Democrat. While living in New York City, his articles appeared in the African Voices literary magazine, as well as the City Sun and the Black Star newspapers. In April 2002, he participated and won the first place award in the Liberian Civil War poetry competition held in Providence, Rhode Island, under the sponsorship of the Liberian Community Association of Rhode Island. The winning poem in that competition was Scene of Sorrow 2. In 2003, the prolific Liberian writer and poet published his first book of poems, Going to War for America. To the surprise of many who had admired his writings back in Liberia, Mr. Konneh enlisted in the U.S. Navy in August 1996. He served for 9 years between 1996 and 2005. While serving on active duty in the U.S. Navy, Mr. Konneh did not bury his activist side. He was the founding chairman of the National Civil Rights Movement, Philadelphia-based Liberian pro-democracy and human rights organization. Through this organization, Mr. Konneh led more than 700 people in demonstration in Washington, D.C. on September 16, 2002 at the Liberian Embassy, demanding the unconditional release of the then imprisoned Liberian journalist Hassan Bility and other illegally detained Liberians by the brutal regime of Charles Taylor. A few months later, he led another demonstration in Washington, D.C., this time at the U.S. Capitol against the continued illegal detention of Liberian human rights activist Luscious Toe and others. Mr. Konneh most recently published a book of poems entitled The Love of Liberty Brought Us Together. Before that, he published his memoir, The Land of My Father's Birth. Mr. Konneh travels frequently back to Liberia and was involved in the 2017 campaign of the Liberty Party. Mr. Konneh, welcome and thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Up next, we have Mr. Othniel Forte, who is in transit right now, so we will sometimes see him. Hopefully before the end of the interview, we'll get to see him. But to tell you a little bit about Mr. Othniel Forte, he edits the Liberian literary magazine entitled Qui, a monthly e-magazine that focuses on promoting Liberian culture, literature, and creativity. This publication blends Liberian literature with that from other cultures in a unique form. The focus is creativity that is colorless, formless, and free. He taught creative writing and English as a second language at Kasastart University in Thailand. He has co-authored a children's book entitled Why Elephant Flees from Goat and published many books, including 6 for a Dozen, Elder's Wisdom, Liberian Parables, and Basis of Banking, the Liberian Financial System. Mr. Forte is the founder of Forte Publishing International, which is based in Liberia and has published over 20 books by Liberian writers, with many of them becoming big sellers on Amazon. Forte Publishing has also begun a reading literacy program in Liberia called Monrovia Reads, which runs the last Friday of every month. The program is free to all and seeks to connect Liberian writers with their audience. So, Mr. Forte, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Up next, and finally, we have Miss Kromah. Kromah was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and grew up in the sleepy suburb of Sykesville, Maryland, the setting of her debut novel, Gin. As a child, Kromah would sit in the living room with her brother and listen to her parents recount the fairy tales of their native land of Liberia, absorbing the words and pictures. Born a storyteller, Kromah would run away with the tales, creating her own versions of the stories for her younger brother. She works as a communications specialist and executive director of Resources and Outreach of Liberia, ROL, a registered US-based nonprofit organization that bridges the gap between Liberia's under-resourced education and health sectors by creating sustainable opportunities. For the last 4 years, she divided her time amongst New York, Baltimore, and Monrovia, Liberia, spearheading projects like Project READ, READ standing for Restoration, Education, and Development, an initiative with the goal of creating safe places for Liberian girls. These will be places that will employ girls with growth and and leadership opportunities. Project Read's first project is to open a girls' drop-in center in a public library. Project Read has acquired well over 40,000 books for their library so far and was featured in the Huffington Post. Their progress was featured on Baltimore's ABC2 News in December 2015. The Project Read is a recent grantee of a seed grant from the Pollination Project and a recent grantee of 4 Imprints 1x1 Products grant. Project Read is fighting to end the epidemic of sexual and gender-based violence against girls in Liberia by turning victims into survivors and implementing programs that will help prevent the victimization of at-risk girls. Through a full library of books, one-on-one counseling, arts programs, weekly group discussions and activities, daily tutoring, career training, community outreach projects, and a place to stay during times of emergencies, Project Read will give girls wings to soar. Last year, Kromah was also launched a global social change initiative, Project Girls Fire, a mission of passing on empowerment from girl to girl, nation to nation. Project Girls Fire is putting together an anthology of short stories written by women and girls to inspire girls globally. Thanks for being here, Ms. Kromah. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, so I've finally gotten through all of our profiles. Amazing guests we have tonight, and we're excited to talk to them and just talk about literature and what the Liberian voice is in that world. So first, to begin with, I'd like to talk about where your love of writing began for each one of you. So Ms. Kromah, where did your love of writing begin?
Well, before I could even write, I was always a storyteller. Both of my parents are huge readers and academics, so they would always tell us stories. Since my brother and I weren't born in Liberia, they wanted to ensure that we had very close ties to our Liberian roots. So before I could read, I would hear stories of folklore from Liberia and from Mali. And one of the stories that always stood out to me were the stories of the jinn or jinnah. So when I started reading for myself, I started doing research on these stories and how these stories transcended just Liberian culture. And from that, many of my short stories were born. I started writing short stories and books in elementary school, and I was published for the first time in middle school. And from there, it just grew. I'm a ferocious reader as well. I read about 3 different books a week, and I'm always working on something new. I'm currently writing the second book in the series of young adult books that I write, the second book in my series. The second to Jin is called Fulham, and in Mandingo, Fulham means the past. So these stories take us back to Liberia, even though they're set here in the United States, but it deals with a lot of the history of Liberia as well as the folklore. So I intertwine the two and modernize it to gain a following that transcends Liberians.
Ms. Logan, what about you?
I think similar to saying, and I think everyone will probably say this, it all starts from storytelling. And for me, my grandma, she had a big influence. Every single time there was any type of issue, she always had a story to tell in order to either get us to tell the truth or, correct our behavior. So it really stems down to storytelling, and it's kind of just blossomed from there naturally.
Wonderful. Mr. Konneh, how did your love of writing begin?
Well, I started my first learning experience with Quranic education, Islamic education. And every morning we went to the Kalama, who taught us the Quran and other Islamic books. But then in the evening, me and my sibling would get gathered together to tell story. So story from my grandmother, from my mother, from my father inspired me. And when I started reading books in grade school in Liberia, books like Teen Fall Apart, books like Why Nobody Knows When He Will Die, and Murder in the Cassava Patch by Baltimore. All these books kind of inspired my interest in writing. And I felt like if I could read other people's story, I have to have some story I've heard from my grandmothers and other family members since I was a little child. And it's time for me to, to write my own story. So I first wrote 2 poems, which I introduced to the late Clifford Flemister, who encouraged me to keep writing. That was around 1987. And since then, up to now, I've not stopped writing. Every single day, if I'm not doing anything, the most important thing for me is read and write, read and write, read and write. So it's been like that since early 1990 up to this point. And I hope to keep writing until my final breath. Thank you.
Beautiful. Mr. Ford, what about you? How did your love of writing begin?
Well, it's difficult. I cannot really place a time as to when I began writing as far as I can remember. Ironically, I hated writing myself. So, I mean, I found it interesting to pick up. But from elementary time, I recall that I had these little diaries I always wrote in. And then I started from poetry, my thoughts, and so I took quite good notice of reading my report of my diary. And so if we trace it, I could say it started around there. Basically my thoughts, and then poetry started off with poetry.
Great. And it seems we've lost Mr. Geeplay, but when he comes back, we'll add him back into the discussion. So my next question to all of you guys is, who are some other writers and poets and journalists who inspire you? Mr. Konneh, you mentioned Bai Timur already, but who else has inspired you to write, or who else's work do you love?
Well, besides Baltimore and besides Waiton Sankawolo and perhaps the famous Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, I was introduced to African-American literature in the early 90s. And some of the writers that really, really inspired me would include James Baldwin. I read his book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Fire Next Time. Then poets like Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Larry Neal. So a whole lot of writers from the Black experience in America. I think there was a movement in the 60s called the Black Art Movement. And I almost read every writer that was associated with that movement. So if you see any sense of militancy in my writing, advocacy in my writing, whether it is short story or essays or even in my memoir, I learned from those experiences. And actually my first introduction to Pan-Africanism, which is a philosophy that I subscribe to, was inspired by my reading of Hakeem Adibuti, who was born at Leroy's June, but later on he changed his name. So all these guys, one way or the other, inspired me to be the writers I am today. There's so many, I can't call everyone. Someone like Rachel Wright, Hakeem Adibuti, Amiri Baraka, so many. Maya Angelou, of course. I read all the different series of her autobiography from I Know Why the Kitchberg Sings, so many people have inspired me over the years. to follow writing as a career.
And Mr. Geeplay, we missed you there for a moment, so I'm going to ask you, how did your love of writing begin, or when did that begin? Mr. Geeplay?
Oh, well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, I've always liked literature from high school, and then the war came, obviously. There was nothing to do but just read books, lying off the street. So Liberian literature, Doris Harris, of course, Baltimore, Patricia Jabba Wesley, Dama Sharif, met her in my sojourn as a writer. So, and of course, some American writers like I like a lot of the writers, especially and it's Hemingway, of course, who was introduced to me in high school by my high school teacher, and then the other Black writers from the high school.
Okay. And Ms. Kromah, you mentioned reading almost, reading weekly, many books every week. So who are some writers that have inspired?
Honestly, I would have to say my first inspiration would be my mom. If it weren't for my mom and my dad, basically, I wouldn't be a writer. They used to assign writing assignments to us anytime we travel, and both parents traveled a lot, one being in the military and one working in the government. But we used to travel a lot. And on every trip, she said, you want to be a writer? So everywhere we go, I'd have to write a story about that. And so it just became so natural to me. And then I started reading other writers who were interested in the type of literature I was interested in, like Isabel Allende, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, Amy Tan, R.L. Stine, Judy Blume. And basically weekly, my favorites change, but I just love literature. So anything that will take me away from reality is what I will basically sink my teeth into.
Beautiful. And Ms. Logan, who are some of your inspirations?
Right, as already mentioned, some such as Baiti Moore, classic Liberian literature really elevated Liberia in that department. But also closer to me, Miss Ophelia Lewis, who I work closely with, reading her collection of poems, My Dear Liberia, that was very influential in my writing, and especially as it relates to Liberia, because I wasn't born in Liberia. I had to rely on those memories and adopt those memories as my own, and make it a part of my story. So until I had the opportunity to go myself. So that was very impactful to me. As a child, of course, R.L. Stine and all the Goosebumps books, Amelia Bedelia, Peggy Paris. I like those fun children's stories. As an adult, P.S.A. Lehman, he's one of my favorite authors right now. And he wrote a book of essays, How to Kill Yourself and Others Slowly in America. And the way that he speaks so casually, it really helped me, to understand the voice. There's no one specific way to write. Like, everyone has a different story. And I think initially as a writer, in my mind, I had this idea that, how is a writer supposed to sound? And it wasn't until reading books like that, that I, and some that I mentioned, that I realized we all have our own story. We all have our unique sound, and to tap into that. And then, of course, Rebecca Skloot, who's not a African-American writer, but she wrote on the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, and those biographies and real life, nonfiction stories also had an impact on my storytelling, how I tell stories and what interests me.
And Mr. Forte, what about you? Who are some of your favorite writers?
Well, I just talked about the brightness, started off with giving me reading assignments, but I had this funny way of answering me whenever I had questions. So, you know,
The
so,
connection is kind of,
hello?
yes, the connection wasn't strong
Yeah.
there.
So,
Mhm.
so whenever I asked him a question, he sent me on the shelf, and I took a letter from the encyclopedia. Those days we didn't have Google. The Google was the encyclopedia, and he told me read that stuff. So I'll go up there and pull up which letter you wanted me to pull, and he tells me the letter, and he tells me, okay, now you.
Uh-oh. It seems we lost Mr. Forte. So as I said before, Mr. Forte is joining us live from Liberia right now, and so his connection may go and come. And go Mr. Forte?
Hello? Yeah?
Yes.
So I would
Yes.
say more often than not, my dad had me go to the encyclopedia, read up, and then he tells me, what did you understand? Whenever I told him what I understood, then he filled in the gap. But because we traveled around a lot, he made it a point whenever he wasn't around or we were far off, I had to write something like a book report. So in that life, we share something similar. When it comes to writers, I think I never really aspired to want to write someone. I've always admired writing, but I didn't want to write like them. The only person who's taken close to inspiring me to want to write like them was Edwin J. Bach.
Yeah, sorry about that. But he'll join us again to tell us about that author. Okay, there he goes. Yes, you were saying the author who we really liked was Edwin something?
Barclay. Yeah, Edwin, former president of Liberia. Yeah, so I think that's the closest person. And then from there, I would say Roland Dempster. Roland Dempster is someone else that I really wish I probably, if I could say someone I wanted to, but with the exception of those Liberia, the rest of people have named everyone else has named them, and I would say everything. It's hard to say more. I just read everything.
I'm sorry, the connection, okay, isn't strong. So I'll move on. So let's move on to the types of training, whether it be formal or informal, that you all have had to become writers. So Ms. Logan, I'll start with you. What sort of formal or informal training have you had to become a writer?
As far as, well, I think like most people, I didn't grow up really wanting to be a writer. I thought I was going to be a background dancer for like Beyonce, Janet Jackson. That was my dream. And even in that, it's still a form of storytelling, right?
Yes.
So as far as writing, I think just taking a different approach to telling a story just came about naturally. And of course, it started in school. You know, we get projects and
Okay.
the time, my English teacher, they would always ask me, did you write this? And they would ask me to join like literary groups and clubs. And I would always say like, no. But eventually I just fell into it. I started blogging when that became popular. And then just to, tell stories. And then after I graduated from undergrad, I started doing public relations. So of course that's writing. And it seemed like every turn that I took, every job from then on out, I was writing, So for my graduate school, for my master's, I decided to focus on writing and take it seriously and build my skills in there. So that's how I kind of trained. And ever since then, I just write every day and working in the industry, writing and editing, you get enough practice.
Okay. And Mr. Geeplay, what sort of training do you have?
Well, I started off in high school, working on my high school newspapers. then graduated high school and then started working in newspapers as a reporter and for radio and newspapers. And I just love poetry. So I just started off little by little, started writing, and then I, started getting better. Some of the stuff I wrote like 5, 6 years ago, when I read them now, they don't make no sense, because the more you write, the more you get better, So poetry is my specialty, but I want to branch into playwright, and I've done my first short story got published in New Orleans, like I just mentioned earlier on in your introduction. And it's a work in progress. But I've started up in journalism and activism, so my writing speaks to the conditions of our people, and I'm very passionate about what is happening to around me. I'm very aware of that. So we're just working hard to make sure we put Liberia there. This is our time. The Baltimores, the Doris Bank Henrys, and all the older generation have given their contribution. It's our time to help out to promote our country. So I'm just doing what I can do to help out help our literature. And I'm glad that I've been inspired by so many great people around me. And I'm just keep preaching. I'm writing my third book now, my third book of poetry. I've not had a publish it yet, but I'm confident that the future looks bright, because I think we've done a lot of work to be satisfied.
Okay. And Mr. Konneh, what about you? What sort of formal training have you had, or informal training to become a writer?
Well, I've never had any formal training for writing. I think everything just being an inspiration. But what I can say is that when I had the opportunity to contribute as a freelance writer to the our newspaper and the Monrovia Daily News, that became like a training ground for me. I used to write commentary on social political issues, which were greatly appreciated and by the publishers of both the Monrovia Daily News and the our newspaper. I would say those editors, like Mr. Robert Lamia, who is currently working in the Foreign Ministry, he was the editor-in-chief of the our newspaper at the time, were very, very helpful. Whenever I wrote something, I brought it to him, he would critique it and tell me what is right, what is not right. So I didn't have a formal classroom training for writing, but at least I had some training with some editors of newspapers in Monrovia. Mr. Brown used to be the editor-in-chief of Monrovia Daily News. He was very helpful. A lot of other people. I used to also publish articles with the Inquirer newspaper occasionally, but mostly with Monrovia Daily News and the our newspaper. My good friend Robert Cisse used to be the typesetter for the Monrovia Daily News. He was very, very instrumental in encouraging me to keep publishing with that newspaper. So I would say newspapers in Liberia were my training ground for writing. Having an idea, and you have to always show that idea to other people what you're reading, and for them to sometimes go ahead to be published in the newspaper. And I think one of the most important feelings anyone can have, and validation can have as a writer, if you have your material published in the local newspapers and your friends and family and other people read it and give you a pat on the back, that can be the most important inspiration for writing if you don't have the opportunity for formal classroom teaching. But I think I did my undergraduate study on comparative literature, African-American, and Caribbean study literatures. And I think, but I would say that would not be considered for me as a formal training, because I think I was a writer, and my interest in writing encouraged me to get into that program. And it was just like to basically share my story with other people in the classroom setting. But I would credit the Liberian newspapers for giving me an opportunity to be the writers I am today. They gave me the confidence to call myself a writer.
Wonderful. And Ms. Kromah, what about you? What sort of training have you had?
I would say, well, I grew up with two kind of conflicting ideologies. My mother was more of a bloom where you are planted type of person. And my dad just wanted me to reach so far beyond the galaxy. So I would go out searching for opportunities. And when I couldn't find opportunities for people like me, I would try to create those types of opportunities. So if there was a literary competition and it wasn't for children, I would find a way to submit, even though according to the rules, I shouldn't be allowed to submit. And from there, I started to take little classes, and I found a way. I was attending university in Baltimore, and I found a way to move to New York. I just knew to be a writer, I needed to be in New York. So I was offered a job with 17 magazine. So I picked up my senior year and basically had to redo the last 2 years of college just because I wanted that job. So I started writing with 17 magazine, finding all kinds of ways. And I knew I didn't want to do English literature in school because I was already a writer and editor. I'd been doing that in school and newspapers and magazines. So I wanted to do communications because the communications umbrella is so large. You find various mediums for storytelling, and that's what I wanted to do. I didn't just want to be a writer. I wanted to find different ways to tell stories accurately. So worked in TV, film. I worked on the Half the Sky documentary, transcribing and editing the Liberian portions of the documentary, working with Lutheran immigration, talking to refugees to get their story right. You know, that was my big thing, telling people stories in the right way or finding the right way to tell their stories, because so many times other people tell stories for us and they get lost in translation. And that's a huge problem. And that's also a reason why I started my digital media site, Project Girls Fire, because women's stories are always told for us and they're always, I guess, told the wrong way or not accurately. So on my platform, I provide a medium where women and girls can tell their stories with their own voices and not having it being told for them. And that's why I write my books also in first person, because this is someone's personal story, even though it's fictional, it's someone's personal story. And so you get the feeling of immediacy in those stories. And I feel that's very important for a writer. So that's me.
And so you talk about a woman's voice and needing to be able to tell her own story. So then my question to all of you is really, why the need for a woman's voice or a Liberian voice? What is so special about these voices that they need to be present in literature or in media? So Sang, I'll go back to you with that question.
I think it's important for everyone to have a platform to tell their stories, because you never know who your story will reach or who your story will touch. And it's necessary because growing up, being Liberian American at the time, there weren't any Liberian stories that were mainstream unless it was something negative or something about the war or something to do with free slaves. And we all know the Liberian story. There's not just one Liberian story. It's so much bigger than that. And that's the case for everyone. There's not just one story. And there's a problem with the single story because it controls a narrative, and there shouldn't be one single narrative. Everyone needs a platform. Everyone needs a platform to tell their story, and everyone has a right to be heard. That's why I think it's so important that there's no such thing as too many Liberian writers or too many African-American writers. You know, when you limit yourself like that, you miss an opportunity to touch someone who needs to be touched.
Beautiful. And Ms. Logan, as someone who has written for Blavity, or as an editor, sorry, for Blavity, why do you think it's important for the African-American voice? I know Blavity targets African-American or Black people of color, millennials. So why specifically that group? Why people of color? Why do you think that it's so important?
Right. I'll say it's representation, you know, and I think everyone is seeing that now. That's why we have a Black Ariel in The Little Mermaid coming up. That's why we have Black Panther. That's why we have so many of these recreations where the others, you know, are being represented. Because if you never see yourself, then how do you know it's possible? So it's important to tell those stories. It's important for representation. And even just taking it back to Liberia, you know, my work with Village Tales Publishing and the children's book, you know, we have to create stories in our settings. You know, we have to create stories with our faces in them. So that's the simple answer, is just representation and just showing, you know, our different stories.
And Mr. Konneh, you wrote a memoir about your life and also just about, I guess, Liberia and your experiences. Why did you think it was important for you to tell that story, your story?
Well, I think one of the most important things for me as a Mandingo and Muslim growing up in Liberia, in some people's mind, Mandingos are not Liberian, they are foreigners. You know, that things about Mandingo being foreigner, not from Liberia, it dominates in people's mind. And when the war started, I think when Mandingo people were being killed all over the place, to a lot of people, it was normal. So I felt like our story has to be told, you know. So that's why in my book, The Land of My Father's Birth, I started telling the story of my childhood in Nima County.
Oh, sorry. We can still hear you though.
Yeah, okay. It's probably just someone just called me. So what happened is like I decided to write a book so that at least our story, the Mandingo story in Liberia, our contribution to Liberian society from King Sabosu Kamara all the way to our time, I felt like that story needed to be told. Though I've told the same story one way or the other in my book of poetry, but I think there's a difference between poems and narratives. So my book, The Land of My Father's Birth, just wanted to affirm my Liberian identity as a Muslim and Mandingos. Because most people, maybe even in Liberia or outside of Liberia, consider Islam to be maybe a non-Liberian religion. So Liberia is portrayed as a Christian nation. If you just tell the single story of Liberia being a Christian nation, that would ignore a lot of other people that come from the background I come from as a Mandingo and Muslim. And I thought that it was very, very important to tell that story, let my fellow Liberians know what we have contributed to the making of Liberia. That was my motivation for writing my book as The Land of My Father's Birth. And I can say if the Liberian Civil War had not come, I was truly inspired as a Pan-Africanist. My writing would have just taken, you know, the route of an African just trying to tell his African story to the rest of the world. But the war brought different dimension to my understanding of myself and the role I can play in the society.
Wonderful. And Mr. Geeplay, you also, your writing also talks a lot about your experiences in the Civil War. Can you, I guess, explain to our audience how that experience has shaped you and inspired you to write? Like, what did you see that inspired you to write about those experiences?
Well, the Civil War had a very profound impact on me as an individual and my siblings. For somebody who didn't fight or use gun during the war, which was common, given the disadvantages and the abuse, you had to go 2 weeks without eating no food. Couldn't go in no store to loot. Our parents won't allow that. So I almost died. I used to sit and dream about food. And finally I made it through the war, and then it had a profound impact on me and my worldview of how I see our country and the rape and pillage that went on. So um, that really influenced me and gave me the voice to speak for all those who went through those difficult times, going through checkpoints, being, questioned irrationally. And then, of course, my Pan-Africanism is a very big part of my life and my writing. Since I became a Pan-African, my whole worldview was about Africa, about Liberia, and my surroundings, which speaks to African unity and solidarity. So, but like you did ask, the Civil War basically had a profound impact on me because I saw too many things, and I'm proud to say I didn't take part in them. I'm not saying those who took part should blame themselves because people were forced to do things, but I went through a lot and through a lot of suffering and through a lot of indignity, and so yeah, so that had a profound impact on my writing.
Thank you. And so a lot of times when we talk about writing, everyone would understand a writer or author. That's what we think of. We think of literature. But Miss Logan, you are a culture editor. Can you tell our audience exactly what that is and what that entails?
Okay. I also want to speak to also editing fiction and other works with Village Tales Publishing, which is a Liberian publishing company. And I actually, that's how I read Nvasekie's book, The Land of My Father's Birth. And that book taught me a lot, things that I didn't know. So let me just say that on here. Thank you for that, Nvasekie, because without that, I wouldn't have heard that story. And he made it very clear that his story was his specific story, that there are other narratives within the Mandingo, culture, but that's his story and he owned it. And that enlightened me a lot. So just touching back on the importance of that. But as an editor and a culture editor, it's really just pulling the stories together that aren't covered, in the mass media, the stories that the majority might think is not important, but that still speaks to the culture, and helping writers to develop those stories. So that's pretty much what, as a culture editor, my main objective is just pulling the stories and putting them up front that, we need to know about, that are often buried in the main media, and then helping writers tell those stories and develop it.
Great. And so sometimes we find that, especially with Liberian writers, their works are criticized because it's either hasn't been edited or is poorly edited. So Ms. Kromah, can you tell us exactly what your process is for editing and publishing?
Well, when it comes to writing books, luckily I'm signed to a publisher, not a pipe publishing in Independence, Oregon. And I have a team of diligent editors behind me. With Jen, I think we went through a good 4 or 5 rounds of editing, and that's about 400, 500 pages of literature going back and forth and talking to multiple editors at the same time. So you have to be very crucial. And I think reading aloud and having a second, third, fourth set of eyes to look at your work when you're finished writing it, because while you're writing, even if you read it 100 times, you're too close to the work to see errors. So you always need to edit. You always need an editor outside of yourself. Even if you are an editor, it's not a good job to be the sole editor of your work, even if you're self-publishing. And with Project Girlspire, I'm the editor on the website and also the content manager. So I get submissions from all over the world and talk to different women and girls from different places. And I edit, and I also have, well, I used to have another editor, and she's now at Harvard. She's a student at Harvard, and she's amazing, Tina Liu. Mm-hmm. So it's just one editor is not enough.
Wonderful. And Mr. Geeplay, what about you? What is your editing process?
Well, basically, the Liberian listener that we own, we just take summations and go through it and find what speaks to Liberia, what speaks to the issues, and we have our own team of editors, but it's just finding the right op-eds or the right stories that speak to Liberia and the issues we have interest in, which is good governance and public policy. That's why we have interest in. As a writer, basically, as a fiction writer, as a literary writer, I rely on other editors to do my work. People don't understand editors are very, very important. If you want to publish, the work has to be well edited. If it's not edited, it's not going to go nowhere. So, Liberian Listener is just a news and a public opinion website. It's not literary at all. So, when we have stories, we go through it and see what makes sense. And one or two, three editors will see it before it goes out there. Or we take news stories from other websites that we think will speak to our audience.
Okay. And so at this time, I'd like each of you guys to tell our audience about your most recent work and just give them a brief synopsis about the work and how can they support, where can they purchase it, or where can they read it. I'll start with you, Ms. Kromah. What's your most recent work and how can our audience read it?
Well, I have a lot of stories on Project Girlspire, and the website is PROJGIRLSPIRE.com. But my most recent published novel is Jinn, DJINN. And basically, when I was a kid, my dad told me a story about a girl named Femini. It's a Mandingo story. And this girl is very rude and wouldn't listen to anyone. And there was a Gina in town known as Zoom. And nobody was supposed to go to the lagoon at a certain time of day, and Femini wouldn't listen. So she went to the lagoon, and the Gina came for her. She started running, and everyone kept closing the doors in front of her, and no one would open until she finally got to her grandmother's house, and the grandmother asked, "Will you obey from now on if I open the door for you?" She said yes, and so she escaped death by agreeing to behave. So that story stuck with me for a very long time. And I kept rewriting different versions of the story. And finally, I started asking questions like where the story of the Jinnah came from. And it led me to the jinn in Arabic and in the Quran. And it also made me wonder what would happen if Femini grew up and had a child. So in my novel, Jinn, Femini has a child that is separated from her at birth. And this child is raised by a jinn and had no knowledge of her history in Liberia, or the fact that she was born in Liberia, or the fact that she was even African. So in this story, she finds out that who she is not her true origin, and she finds out where she comes from and that she's at the center of a war that she never knew was being fought. It takes you all through Liberian folklore, and it modernizes it because modernizes the folklore that we know from Liberia. And it kind of brings in my background too, because the story takes place in the small town in Maryland that I grew up in called Sykesville. And from there, you find out how the Jinnah relates to Liberia and where the stories come from and so forth. And I'm currently working on the second book. And the first book was a bestseller on Amazon. It was featured in Publishers Weekly for having the best first line of April 2018. And I think everyone will love it. It isn't just for young adults, even though that's the genre that it sells in, young adult fantasy, but anyone could fall in love with the story.
Beautiful. It sounds like a great story. So anyone can purchase your book, Jinn, your novel, Jinn, on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's in paperback, hardcover, and on Kindle too.
Okay, great. And Ms. Logan, what is your most recent work and how can we get to it?
Okay. I recently published Better Together, which is a part of the Adventures at Camp Pudicho book series. It's a children's book that takes place in the middle of the Liberian rainforest. And most people don't know that, Liberia has the second largest rainforest in the region, has a lot of unique animals. Of course, we all heard of the pygmy hippo, but there are also a lot of endangered animals in Liberia as well. So the children's story, it's about these 10 animal campers and all of their adventures in the rainforest. And it teaches lots of different learning, developmental information for kids. So my first book, Better Together, is on www.camppudicho.com. And there will be more in that series as well. And it's also a part of the Reading Our World campaign, which is from Sapo Books, which is the children's imprint of Village Tales Publishing. And there are a lot of Liberian writers and illustrators and African writers and illustrators who write to that. So if people want to get books for their children that are African theme and focus, definitely check that out. And I also want to add, because next year is the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, and Go Team Liberia is covering the Liberian athletes. We've been covering them on their journey year round. We do it all the time. So I really want to encourage everyone to start paying attention to that, start supporting these athletes. They're on their road to qualifying, which is not easy. And it's also, people think that Liberia just sends people, but for the most part, these athletes are working hard and they have to qualify to reach the Olympics. So please support the athletes. Check out Go Team Liberia and also Better Together. Thank you.
Great. Okay, and Mr. Geeplay, what is your most recent work and how can our audience get to it?
Well, my most recent work was published in New Orleans, a literary magazine called Regulars. So 3 poems that I submitted. And one of the poems is a Me Too poem, speaking to rape and then sexual harassment against women. So it's right there on www.regulars.com, or if you Google my name, Cherbo Geeplay, you'll find it. It's in a couple of poems out there to read if you Google my name. So it's out there on the internet. It's to be seen. My first book is done. It's going to go for editing next month. And then I will, start finding the publisher in the kind of thing wherever it is published. But I don't have a book out right now.
And Mr. Konneh, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So what is your most recent work, and how can our audience support?
My last work, my most recent work is the Love of Liberty Brought Us Together. It's a collection of poems, and it's available on Amazon.com. Besides that, I'm also working on 2 different manuscripts right now. One is I would say, a collection of interviews that I've done with Liberian writers over the year and book reviews. I've reviewed so many Liberian books. I did interview with Kromah. I did interview with Patricia Jebe Wesley. I did interview with the late Peter Bala. I've got so much materials on the Liberian writers and artists. That is something I'm trying to put out. It's called the Liberian Voices. It's not out yet. Besides that, I'm also working on collection short stories. I've gone far into it. I'm hoping that before the year end, or maybe early next year, those 2 books should come out. That's my current project, but at least all my other 3 books, The Land of My Father's Birth, The Love of Liberty Brought Us Together, and One to War for America, they are all available on Amazon.
Okay. Wonderful. And so, Ms. Logan, you mentioned starting the Go Team Liberia blog and now media platform. And sometimes I think we forget that even sports writing is still writing. So can you tell us a little bit about how you started that project?
Okay, thank you. I want to shout out my co-creator, Madia Addy, who also works with me and has built the blog up to what it is right now. But it actually started in 2008 when a close family friend of mine, who was Madia's brother, he qualified to represent Liberia. And before then, I did not know that Liberia competed in the Olympics. And I always watch the Olympics, but of course, when you're in the States, they only show the teams, they show certain teams depending on what region you are. So when I found out that he was competing, he would feed me information and I would blog about it. That's also how I started building my blogging as well. And people were interested. They were like, wow, we didn't know Liberia was even in the Olympics. This is in 2008. And so just started blogging. And then in 2012, we turned it into something, Madi and I joined together and turned it into something that was more substantial. Village Tales Publishing gave us a platform to host the site and turn it into like a full-fledged media site. Then we started connecting with actual sports federations on ground to see what the needs of the home-based athletes were and to also follow their stories. We worked with the liaison, Kute Mawen, who also is a former Olympian. And we just started posting the stories. So if you go on the site, you'll see lots of stories. So far, 2 track athletes have qualified to represent Liberia next year. So we're just following and praying and hoping that more athletes will qualify. And also even in the Paralympics, you know, we had a Paralympian in 2012 for the first time who qualified as a powerlifter. So it happened, it just started from blogging and it just grew in as more people were interested.
Awesome. And Mr. Geeplay, you also have your own website, LiberianListener.com. So can you please just tell our audience a little bit more about that platform?
Well, like I said, the website speaks to Liberian issues, and then Liberian news and opinions, and then after a while, we just turn it into a Pan-African platform for for Africa. So we just speak to African issues, corruption, and good governance, and public policy. We're basically a public policy website that speaks to the stuff that our people care about. If you look at Africa today, there's so many issues going on, but the primary issues in Africa today concerns corruption. That's it. And so we turn to be very sympathetic to issues that have to do with graft and abuse of power, basically. So Liberian Listener is, it's not a literary website, but we also carry we carry stories about Liberian artists or African artists, and we don't just want to limit the website to political issues. So it's basically we'll talk about arts and politics and social issues, women issues, that kind of thing, wherever it is. So it's just basically a website that speaks to the issues we care about as Africans.
Great. And Ms. Kromah, I know we read your profile, which was a little old, so I need you to catch us up to date, put us up to date on Project Read and your Girls Fire platform and how our audience could help.
Well, I partnered with Brenda Brewer Moore and donated the books to keep her project. So that's what we did with the books. And because she's opening a huge library in Liberia. And with Project Girls Fire, we're actually settled in the Philadelphia area now, and we're working on a project called Anonymous. We sat down and had 12 conversations with 12 different women who had stories to tell but didn't want to put a name on these stories. So we had these discussions and we fictionalized these stories, and each week we release a new story on the platform. The first was released last week, and the next story is going to be released by tomorrow, I believe. And by September, after the 12th story is published, we're going to have an event in Philadelphia where other women are going to read these stories live. It's just more ways of storytelling, and that's all we do on Project Girls Fire.
So if I decided I wanted to start writing, how could I get my work on your platform?
Definitely send me an email and we'll talk.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm always open to new contributors, so let's talk.
So let me ask you a question. Is your platform just for girls? Or what about men like us? Can we send an article and a contribution?
Well, I've actually had a male contributor before, but it depends on what you're writing about. This is female-centric content, so we'd have to talk and see how it aligns with our mission.
All right, so if I have to write something, it has to be about girls, right?
Girls or women, or a story pertaining to something maybe that you experienced, but it has to be about women or girls in some sort of way.
Okay, that's good.
And so when we talk about writing, you know, it's very common for people to talk about a voice. And sometimes a voice in literature can be so powerful. It can be life-changing. It can be life-altering or inspiring. And so recently in Liberia, for the Independence Day celebration, the orator for the event was Lima Bowie, the Nobel Peace awardee. And some may not have liked what she said. Others were inspired by what she said. Either way, it took a lot of guts, if you will, for her to give that speech in the presence of the president and those in the ruling party or ruling position, as she called it in her speech. Mr. Konneh, you were writing and providing commentaries on the government and the situations in Liberia at a tumultuous time in our history. So what made you so brave to still speak your voice and not silence it because of maybe the pressures from your environment?
Well, you know, the first thing for any writer is inspiration. When you are inspired to do something, sometimes you will disregard your environment and just do it. When I first said I wanted to be a writer, my brother, who was studying medicine at the time, he said, no money in writing. And I said, that's what I want to do. And I remember not too long ago when I went to Liberia to launch my book, my second book, The Land of My Father's Birth, some family members were saying, well, every time your friends come to Liberia, they bring cars. You know, Madingo people love cars. But every time you come, you talk about books. And I said, well, that's what I'm interested in. You know, I'm a writer. So it's always a good thing to talk about books, to at least introduce people to our stories. But let me just acknowledge Manseen Logan. She did tremendous work on my book, The Land of My Father's Birth. She was one of my editors, including Dr. Abla Dukley. And there's a fellow I was introduced to in Holland by Vamba Sharif, who actually changed the narrative style in my book. It was supposed to be a collection of my newspaper articles, but he said, you know, you have a lot of great experience. It's a good thing that you put it in a narrative form. So that's why when Sam Kromah said today, it's good to talk to different editors, share work to different editors, so everybody's going to bring different perspectives to it. Then you can make the choice now of different options. And Manseen Logan was tremendously helpful in the editing process for my work. And I have to, at least, you know, she talked about it, I have to publicly acknowledge that. And it's a great thing that she's on the show today. I have been a kind of connector of Liberian writers. You know, I was the one that connected Professor Moje Nangbe, Ophelia Louis, Robert Sisse, because I have real interest in writing. And I've always thought that it's just not about me. I should be able to connect different writers. It's through me that we came out with the idea of Liberian Writers Network, which membership included myself, the late Sankawolo, Professor Kim Nagbe, the lady that used to be editing the Liberian Literature magazine. She also used to be part of it. So it's a great thing that we come together here today to get to know each other. I know I've talked to Manseen before, but this is my first time to see her live. It's a great thing. Kromah is like a little sister to me because her father is a great person in our community, and not just in our community, in the Liberian community as a whole. He's a great personality who has touched our life in so many ways. So it's great to see all of you guys here today.
Thank you. And so as we draw to a close, one of my last questions to you guys is, if someone out there wants to be a writer, what is your advice to them? And I'll start with you, Ms. Kromah.
Write every day. Don't take a break. You have to write every day. Write about what happened to you throughout that day, or maybe even fictionalize what happened to you during that day. The problem with beginning is if you stop. Once you start writing, you can't stop. You have to keep going, and something will click for you until you decide what you want to write. Even if you're writing a book, even if you don't know what you want to write, just write something. That's how you become a writer. You just don't stop, write without ceasing.
And Mr. Geeplay, what is your advice to someone who would like to become a writer?
Like saying, say you have to write every day. You have to read a lot. Reading is part of it. Reading is what you is what makes you. You got to speak to a lot of people. Like Othniel Louise have been a very, very important mentor to me. I spoke to her a lot of time, you know, when I was coming up or getting the game. I'm a new writer. I've not been always been writing, but I've always been inspired to write. And Othniel Louise is very, very, very important. Give me a lot of advices, you know, a lot of resource and inspiration. And so, like I said before, Nvasekie Konneh too is very important. Even Manseen, I was speaking of Manseen a lot of times, you know, and I've had getting a lot of ideas from different writers and inspiration from different writers, including who I've named earlier on, including Patricia Jabber Wesley, Romeo Mark, and Stephanie Horton have been a very, very important sojourner in my career. Bless her wherever she is. I hope she's healthy. And so sometimes you just talk to writers and share ideas and get inspired. Read books, you know, James Baldwin, who I love a lot, you know, and all the different writers, you know, you just inspire yourself. Read the writers you like, who you see yourself in, and then inspire yourself. Like I always look up to Neruda, Pablo Neruda, who from the first time I read Pablo Neruda work, my work have never been the same. So, you know, you don't limit yourself to your surroundings. You know, just because you're Liberian writers don't mean you have to force yourself to read Liberian.
Exactly.
Just because you're Africans don't mean you have to force yourself to read African books. You know, and go out there, explore. Like Ernest Hemingway, you know, and William Faulkner. You know, I mean, a lot of American writers, a lot of Asian writers, a lot of European writers will inspire you. But you got to read, and like Son said again, you have to write every day. Sometimes I try to do it, I can't keep up. So sometimes I just do maybe, you know, I want to write a poem a day or 2 poems a day. Sometimes I want to write every day. Sometimes I just take a break, because when I put too much work into my stuff, it just take a lot of stuff out of me. So sometimes I need a break. I can keep up, but you got to write every day. The more you write, the more you get better.
And Ms. Logan, what is your advice to aspiring writers?
Just to reiterate what's already been said, of course, write every day, read. And I'll just add this. I mean, nowadays, it's very easy to self-publish, to get your story out there. But after writing and slaving and publishing and printing and getting out there, then comes the hard part, which is selling the book. So I would say that if you could take a class on marketing, if you can really connect with people who have access, even if it's something as simple as locations and halls where you can host your book readings when you do your book tour, or just connecting with somebody outside of just writing, so you're able to push your book, you know, if you decide to self-publish, or connecting with agents, you know, who have access to those different resources, because writing is just one part of the process. But then there are a lot of books that nobody knows about. So you definitely want to make sure that you are aware of the business side of it, and making sure that you know how to get your books out there in front of people.
Yeah. And that being said, also, does anyone here have an agent that helps to publicize their book or get them in front of audiences?
I'm signed to an indie publisher, and that was one of the reasons why I signed to an indie publisher. You kind of get lost in the excitement of a big publisher sometimes, and having an indie publisher, they're willing to go above and beyond. And my publisher is a mentor too, because he's also an English teacher too. So besides serving as my agent and all of that, he makes sure that everything is in check. And since my audience basically is young adults, he makes sure that it goes to his students first. So they'll critique it. And if it's something that high school students consume, then I know it's good enough and ready to be published.
And Mr. Konneh, do you have anything else to add to advice for aspiring writers?
Well, I just want to buttress what is being said by others. What I will add to what others have said is that criticism is part of writing.
Yep.
You know, I've been approached by a lot of young people, more especially when I go to Liberia. I met a young man who brought his manuscript to me. And obviously, I was not satisfied with his manuscript. And the first question I asked him, who are some of the writers that you really, really admire? I asked him, I said, can you name me three writers? And he could not even name me one writer that have inspired him. And I said, no, you're not ready to publish book, you know? And I even told him I said, look, we live in a social media age. Open your Facebook page and start sharing your writing there. And maybe, you know, from critiques other people are going to give you, you may come to understand what a craft of a writer is, you know, because sometimes we're not frank with each other. Someone brings work to you and you look at it, it's just not up to task. Then you just want to make them feel good. So it is always good to listen to people that are going to be brutally frank with you to tell you what you need to do. And don't take any criticism to be too personal, because someone may want to help you, but if that person just gives you false praises, it's not good enough.
Exactly.
Listen to that person's criticism. So I told the young man, I said, look, your work is not ready for publication. You have not even written for any newspaper. I said, look, you could also start writing for local newspapers, publish poems in Daily Observer, which has been very helpful to Liberian writers. And maybe that way you're going to pick up. But don't just be so excited about your name being on the book, even if the book is not good enough. So I think our young brothers and sisters that are inspired to write, they also have to open up to criticism. Know that criticism is not coming from a position of envy or jealousy against you. It's just trying to make you a better person or better writer. So criticism just, I feel like it's part of writing.
Yeah.
Right now, nowadays, since with the Facebook, you know, I found real interest in commenting on a lot of different issues. If you check my Facebook page at any time, I may talk about politics, I may talk about writing, I may talk about religion, talk about different stuff every day on my Facebook page. That's been very, very inspiring to me. So like people saying, write every day. Not only do I write every day in my notebooks, I also write every day on my social media page. whether it's Instagram or Facebook. I see that has been very great tools of connection between me and my audience that are spread around, some in Liberia, some in Europe, some in Australia, and some in all over America. So social media has been a very godsend opportunity. A lot of time, me and my wife fuss about, she'll say, oh, you spend a lot of time on social media. And I tell her, look, Facebook is my CNN. You cannot cut me away from that, because all the time, sure, you go on social media to look for girlfriend. No, that's not the case. That's the only way I could be able to share my story to the rest of the world.
Awesome. One question from our host, Dennis, who's not here today. He says, what is the role of literature in social, political, and the economic development of Liberia? So that's for anybody who would like to answer.
Well, I would say it this way. It is unfortunate that Liberians talk about politics more than anything else. Mm-hmm. So politics dominates the conversation in the Liberian society. And I guess that's because our school system do not emphasize on literature the way it's supposed to. So as a result, you bring any other issue up, Liberians are not interested. But we who are interested in literature, we have to really, really work hard to make our work to be felt among our people. It's a great thing for writers to think about their work being embraced by all the other people, but the people whose story you are telling, they have to be involved in the support that you need for your work. And great nations are noted not just by their politics, but by their creativity, by their literature, by their art, and culture. Jamaica is known today around the world for reggae music. If Jamaica is not known for any other thing, there's a lot of negativity in Jamaica. But positive, reggae music is one positive aspect of Jamaican life. When you talk about reggae, people go to Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Gregory Isaac. So I think for Liberia to be out there, along with the rest of the world, we have to come out to promote literature. We have to promote reading culture in our society. That's what we need. A country does not develop on politics alone. Literature plays a major role in the country's development.
Ms. Kromah, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, can I also say that literature does not exist without society and vice versa, because basically the literature that exists narrates what is happening in society, and whether it's political or the economy, even if it's fiction you're writing, it's going to coincide with what's happening in that writer's reality, even if it's sensationalized. So many people will say, oh, I don't read because I don't like fiction, or I don't like anything that isn't rooted in reality. And that's absolutely what people don't understand. Even fiction is rooted in reality. Even the most fantastical story has its roots in society and what's happening in the world around them.
Okay, and so as we bring it to a close, I just want to give this space or time to you guys to just give your final thoughts, whether it be on literature or your work, or anything new that you're working on. So I'll start with you, Ms. Logan, for your final thoughts and statements for tonight.
All right, my final thoughts is just another reminder: go to goteamliberia.com or teamliberia.com on social media, and let's support these athletes. And also for Sapo Children's book, Reading Our World, we have a campaign where people can buy books to donate to organizations like KEEP and other organizations that are in Liberia that are promoting children's literacy. And all of these authors and illustrators are African and mostly Liberian. So please go to Village Tales Publishing and check out the children's books there, and support the program so we can get kids interested in reading and seeing themselves at a younger age. So thank you. And thank you for having this platform.
Yes, thanks for being here. Mr. Geeplay, what are your final comments and thoughts tonight?
Well, my final comments and thoughts would be to buttress what Mr. Konneh said earlier on. I don't think the problem is with our school system. I think the problem is with our policymakers. They have no interest in literature. They have no interest in Liberian arts. And that got to change. You know, I mean, we can't be going to school and be learning about European books and learning about other people's culture, reading other American books and Liberian writers who are trying to tell the stories of their people. You know, their books are being marginalized. It's not fair and it's not good for our culture, for our children, for ourselves. You can go to school and learn about what's happening to Benjamin Franklin or what happened to Thomas Paine, but you can read about what, you know, about great Liberian pictures like Albert Port. It doesn't make no sense. So I think the Liberian policymakers, you know, especially the information ministry and the cultural affairs, should take interest in Liberian literature and promote Liberian arts and cover programs that speak specifically to Liberian literature and Liberian arts and how we can promote our culture to our writers. Because what we write is history. I mean, like you have writers who've been gone 50 years ago. Liberian writers like Doris Bank-Henrys or Baltimore, we still talk about them today. Waiton Sagamolo, we still talk about them today. You know, or the great American writers, or the great Asian writers, or the great Nigerian writers. Why is it that Liberian writers their voice can be heard because our policymakers don't have interest in arts and literature? And I think that's how to change. And I want to thank you very much for this platform, and I hope the Liberian media itself will promote Liberian literature like the Focus on Liberians doing. Liberian newspapers should focus on Liberian writers, should focus on Liberian arts. Everything in our papers is about politics. We open the papers about this other, you know, government minister, this, that, but you have nothing about arts going on in our media, or if it's going on, it's very minute. So I think that needs to change also, because the more our arts come to our people and our children and ourselves, the more the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Konneh,
yes.
What are your final thoughts and comments for tonight?
All right, my final thought is that Liberian writers need to be more selfless, engaging with one another, reviewing each other's work. I think I would say within the last 5-10 years, I guess I'm the only one that have reviewed more than 10 Liberian books by other Liberian writers. And it is true that my good friend Othniel Forte found me, and he and I have been very great collaborating partners. We talk about newspapers not promoting Liberian writers. But if Liberian writers are not even writing about each other's work, they are not profiling each other, they are not interviewing each other. And if we are not doing that, how do we expect newspaper publishers who are primarily focusing on politics to do anything? You know, I'm sitting here, like I said, I went out to find Ophelia Lewis. I went out to find K. Manseen, connected all these people in a way to promote Liberian literature. And one of my books that I'm working on is the anthology of interviews and book reviews I've done with all these people, including my little sister, Kromah, Patricia Jabba Wesley. I think that's what we need to do more of. You know, I interviewed the late Peter Bala. I interviewed Jala Keke Kamara. All these are coming out in my next book. So I think if we become so selfless and not just think about ourselves, we should think about other people. You know, that's the only way the world's going to go out there about the work we are doing. I should be able to talk about Manseen Logan, and she should also be able to, she did a review. Not only did she do editing of my work, she also did a review, which I also published, you know, on social, I mean, on internet, on some website. We need to do more of that. Like this particular program we're on, Dennis just told me, Nvasekie, can you bring some writers so we can talk about Liberian literature? And I'm the one that connected all these people you see on the platform here tonight. I talked to Othniel Forte in Liberia, I talked to Kromah, Manseen, Logan, and I think we need more of that. The more we do that, the better we're going to go some places. Thank you, and God bless. Focus on Liberia. I think among all the talk shows in America, your talk show is the most important one. It's the best because you're not only focusing on politics. You talk about different aspect of Liberian life, which is a very good thing. And just keep on doing a good job. And we, whenever possible, we're definitely going to be there to provide whatever support we can to your platform. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Konneh. And I'm sorry we couldn't have Othniel Forte on the show today. I think his connection wasn't very good. So we'll try our best maybe to schedule something else with him so he can tell his story and tell us about his works and his publishing company in Liberia. But to all of our guests, we thank you. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work that you do. We thank you for putting the Liberian voice or the voice of the Liberian that was born in America, or the
I didn't get to get my final word.
Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I just want to reiterate that with Project Girlspire, we're always open to submissions. We constantly reach out to people and put out calls for submissions, and it's not just articles or stories. Any kind of medium, if you have a short video or anything like that. We featured so many different Liberian women and girls like Wilhelmina Cooper, Mayinaway Designs, and Brenda Brewer Moore, so many others, and we're always open. So contact me. My email address is skromah@PROJGIRLSPIRE.com. And also, Jen is available on Amazon. I don't know if you can see this good enough, but just put in Sang Kromah, and Jen is spelled DJINN, and stay tuned for book 2, Fulham, which means the past in Mandingo.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, so once again, thank you to everyone. Thanks for being here. I want to encourage our audience to please go out there and support our writers so that way they can continue writing and telling our stories. All of them have shared their books and their websites. So even if it's a website, visit it, read the articles. I'm sure it'll be appreciated. So thanks, and please join us again next Sunday at 6 p.m. Sorry, we were really late today, but we'll be back again next week at 6 p.m. Eastern. We hope you all have enjoyed our exploration of Liberian culture for this Liberian Heritage Month. We've talked about arts and culture, and today we talked specifically about literature. So thank you. There would be no us without you. And so thank you, and good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.